This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Before hostilities begin, Flower of Scotland is sung to a dirge-like tune. The anthem recalls the triumph at Bannockburn as though it were a matter for mourning. Proud Edward's army is defeated, and in an unlikely anachronism, Robert the Bruce is said to have sent him homeward to think again. Kings and battles, flags and tartan, these appear to be the stuff of history for the crowd. A procession of armies across Scotland's landscape, the drama of warfare and raid, picturesque ruins, important dates, are all lines in a familiar recital. Until the 19th century, the story of Scotland circled around the doings and decisions of elites, of tiny groups of powerful and interconnected people. Monarchs, aristocrats and churchmen actually made history, or at least had control over its recording. Over most of the vast span of all that experience in what is now Scotland, there was simply no place for the stories of ordinary lives, of the agricultural labourers whose back-breaking toil formed the landscape, the tradesmen whose skills made the work easier, and the masons who built the great churches, castles and grand houses. The Murrayfield crowd cannot know anything about these unrecounted generations, except for one simple thing, that they were their ancestors. And that irreducible fact is the rock upon which this book and all the research behind it is built. As the tramp of invading armies echoes and fades, and in the long shadows behind the stately line of kings and noblemen and their stately homes, we may now at last be able to make out the modest outline of a people's history of Scotland, our people, ourselves, our history, a story of Scotland we can all own. The Murrayfield crowd hold it inside themselves, a long hidden story of unlikely and unsurprising links, a story that reaches back beyond kings and queens to the very beginnings of settlement in Scotland after the end of the last ice age, a story that is more than 11,000 years old. It is the story of our DNA. Every Scot is an immigrant. Until 9000 BC, Scotland was empty of people and animals. For 15,000 years, ice, more than a kilometre thick in places, had crushed the land under a pitiless white sterility where nothing could live. When the ice sheets finally retreated, small bands of pioneers moved north into a virgin landscape. Their names are not known, but scientists have been able to discover a great deal about where they came from. Immigrants arrived in what would become Scotland over thousands of years, well into the historical period, and their descendants are still here, flourishing, carrying on the long journey of their genes. By approximately AD 1000, the process was almost complete, and most of the pieces of our patchwork of DNA were in place. Significant but small groups did come to Scotland after 1000, but in statistical terms, their impact was minimal. This is why the balance of this book is heavily tilted towards prehistoric and early historic times. DNA research works best in a chronological context, and that is the reason for the first landmarks in our history being clearly plotted in this story, although some of these turn out to be misleading. Language and its development are closely linked to who we are and where we came from, and the evolution of Old Welsh, Scots, English and Gaelic is an important theme. There exist fascinating linguistic links, and many of them were forged in deep time, tens of thousands of years ago, as our ancestors crossed seas and rivers to walk into empty landscapes and populate the earth. As well as Y chromosomes, men inherit surnames, and as these came increasingly into common use in the early modern period, they help set genetic findings against a familiar background. For example, Scotland's Highland clans often claim descent from a common name father, but recent research shows that some of these men may have been fathers in more than name only. None of what follows would have been possible without the pioneering work of two scientists working in the universities of California. In the 1960s, Professor Luca Cavalli-Sforza was the first to apply genetics to history, and he used the first DNA markers to do this. These were the familiar blood groups, ABO, rhesus, and so on. Earlier research had shown that these differ between populations across the world, and using these findings, Cavalli Sforza built a version of a family tree